Hey everybody, Jeff Miller here. I'm the COO at Target Test Prep, and I'm happy to be back on a GMAT Club Live. I know most of you are familiar with Target Test Prep, but for a little bit of background, we've been around since about 2008. We started Target Test Prep with the idea that in some ways, test prep was a little broken and we set out to fix it. And we thought we could do that with the best possible curriculum, the best possible technology. And, the good news is fast forward to 2022, we think we've done a lot to fix that and we're certainly not done. And the nice thing is, the team is fast at work, continuing to improve and make TTP the best it possibly can. And students have been doing really, really well in the GMAT. And I'm super pumped to have Harrison here and Shanaya. And these are two great success stories from Target Test Prep. They both ironically scored 760, so that's easy. Easy to remember, not easy to do. It's two very different things. So we're going to chat today. If you guys have questions, obviously put them in the chat box. I'll try to filter those through to Harrison and Shanaya. And you guys can learn a little bit about what it is they did on their GMAT journey, how they use Target Test Prep. And before I forget, there's one other order of business. Since it is Cyber Monday and it was Black Friday, we actually extended our Black Friday sale. So same code that we've had, it's 20% off any GMAT plan. And the code is Black Friday 20. I think that was just put into a caption here in the screen. So anyway, if you haven't gotten the course yet, get it. The sale's amazing. The course is amazing. So let's move on to talking to Harrison and Shanaya. So I think it's helpful for them to give some background on themselves. So we can start with Shanaya. Why don't you just give a brief background on yourself, kind of what you do, as an applicant, from an applicant perspective, so people can learn a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure. So nice to be here, everyone. My name is Shanaya Fosdar. I've been working for about 3.5 years in the life sciences consulting space. And before that, I went to school for undergraduate at UNC Chapel Hill under the Gilling School of Public Health. And I majored in health policy and management. So very much on the healthcare side of business.
Awesome. And Harrison, what about yourself?
Yeah, so Harrison Davis, I was born in California, went to school in Utah where I studied supply chain management. And for the past 3.5 years or so, I've been working in Shell's trading group as a supply chain development lead. And now I'm currently attending Chicago booth on weekends as well.
Okay, awesome. So that's a bit of background for Shanaya and Harrison. And I think a good place to start here as far as, your journey in general. And Shanaya, we can go back to you. Can you give some background on your GMAT journey, where you found TTP during your journey and kind of some important highlights, from beginning to end, and how TTP played a role, with your preparation?
Yeah, sure. So I started studying, I want to say about November or December of last year. And I started with the official GMAT books. They had a few guides where they had the practice questions for both verbal and quant, and they even had a few practice tests as well. So I started there, but I always knew from the beginning that I kind of probably would need some additional help just from my previous test prep for other exams I had taken, growing up in high school and college. So I kind of knew I would probably need some additional help beyond the official GMAT prep books. So I started to look into, after I went through all the questions, also had online questions for the official GMAT. I started to look into what would be the best supplement source for me. And I actually heard about Target Test Prep from a friend. And I even was reading consistently online that Target Test Prep was a great resource. And I really wanted something that was self-paced. That was a big thing for me because I knew that I learned a lot better in a self-paced environment than I did if someone were to teach it to me. So I stumbled upon Target Test Prep for that reason. And I saw that, you could track your progress. You could, start out with a diagnostic test and it would tell you exactly, what some of your problem areas might be and what you might need to focus on and kind of set the stage for my studying journey. So I really like that aspect of Target Test Prep. And so I would say that November, December, I started doing the official GMAT stuff. And then in January, I would say I actually started Target Test Prep. And then I used Target Test Prep for about 3 to 4 months from January through April, which is when I took my first GMAT attempt.
Right. And that, I think you said, was a 700, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And had you, at that point, had you completed all of Target Test Prep, or was it most of it and then you took the test and then you finished it and retook, or how did that process go?
Yeah, sure. So I will take a step back and say my first practice exam was like a 610. And that was before I'd done any studying at all. Then I did a little bit of studying through the official GMAT materials. I would say got up to like a 660, 670. And obviously, my goal at least was it was above a 700. So
Right.
I knew that I needed some more studying, some more materials because I'd exhausted all the official GMAT resources. So then I started Target Test Prep. I didn't complete all of it before I took my first exam. My first exam was like the beginning of April. So I got a 700 then, and I realized that. So my biggest, so what I started out with basically with Target Test Prep was the math, because I'm very comfortable with math, but I was missing a lot of the basics that I learned back in school. In high school, I hadn't taken any math in college. So I was really missing the basics of like things like prime numbers, greatest common factor, lowest common multiple, those kinds of things that you don't really see on a regular day-to-day basis anymore. So because of that, I was like, okay, I'm going to start there. And for me, I think I was also just more comfortable with math. So I just started there as well. Because I think for me, it was a lot easier to know, like, okay, as long as I have these foundations, I can apply these foundations, versus with reading, I think it was a lot more strategy that came into play. So I focused a lot more on the math before I took my first exam, because to me, I thought, reading will just come naturally, even though I later realized that was not the case. So after my first attempt, I went back onto Target Test Prep and I really focused on the reading a lot more.
Nice. On the verbal, right. Yeah, no, and that happens for sure. You just think, oh, well, if I'm a native English speaker, I can handle the verbal side. And yes, eventually you realize, oh, wow, I need to study that as well. And obviously, I guess that extra effort and time brought you obviously from the 700 to the 760 where your score is now.
Yeah,
great.
Exactly.
Awesome. And Harrison, why don't you talk about your kind of journey as well, where you were when you found TTP and then how you kind of used that throughout your process.
Yeah, I honestly feel like I could just say ditto to a lot of what Shanaya said. So decided I wanted to go to business school, needed to take the GMAT, went on Amazon and searched GMAT prep. And obviously, the official book came up first. So I just ordered that one. Used it for about, a week. I think I took one diagnostic test, realized that I was pretty good on the verbal side of things, but needed a lot of refreshers on quant. Like Shanaya, I hadn't taken a math class, I think, in 4 or 5 years. So how to calculate the GCF and whatnot was something I needed a refresher on. So the problem I had with that official book is I think it had a lot of good practice, but I needed someone to actually teach me the concepts, not just throw a bunch of practice problems at me. So after that first diagnostic test, I kind of set that to the side and started looking for a program that would actually teach me the concepts. Did a lot of research online, reading different forums. And like I said, the quant was the big one for me. And so I was really searching for what's the best quant out there. And I needed it to be something that was self-paced because I have a busy work schedule, family life. So my typical studying was going to be, 10 p.m. to midnight or something in there. I couldn't really work off of someone else's schedule. So I kept seeing things pop up. I think the one that ultimately sold it for me was some Reddit forum. It's always good to make big, important life decisions based on what people say on Reddit. But someone on Reddit was just raving about Target Test Prep's quant. And so I gave a few other free trials for different programs to try, but ultimately said, okay, I'm going to go with Target Test Prep. And then so I started studying the official GMAT prep book in November of last year, found Target Test Prep early December. And then from December through when I took the test on, I think it was March 5th, I was just all in on the quant section of Target Test Prep. So
Yeah.
worked my way through the steps, the modules, just kind of followed the process that they laid out, really honing in on the sections they said I needed to work on based on that initial diagnostic test that TTP gives you, and went from there.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's great. I mean, the free trial, the trial we talk about all the time, whether free or $1, depending on where you find it. I mean, it's so huge because it's full access. So you get a chance to I mean, yeah, you want to hear people's opinions, but then you want to check it out with your own eyes. It's no different than, buying a car and giving it a test drive. So I think that's great. And I think what's interesting about both of your situations, and we'll talk about the study plan in a second, but you found a way to make Target Test Prep work for you. And the course is extremely thorough, but Shanaya, coming from a 610 start, even into a 670, I think you said before you started the course, like, you had a really good foundation. So you were able to take the things you needed from TTP and really use them. And in Harrison, it sounds like the same. Like, for example, you said, well, I'm better at verbal. I don't need as much verbal help. So now I can focus on quant. And we made it that way because you don't want to force every student to have to go down the same exact path. Now, the good news is if you need the path, it's there, and that's transitioning into the study plan. So I imagine to a degree, both of you followed the study plan we had laid out, and then you kind of took the components of it that you needed, but you had the general structure of what to follow. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, for me, absolutely. I pretty much just went down that path on the study plan for the quant section, with the exception of I was scrambling a little bit for time at the end. And so I skipped a couple sections I was already strong in and focused in on the
Right.
ones that the diagnostic test showed me I really needed to work on.
Yeah. And what about you, Shania? You in a similar boat?
Yeah, I would say I would try a couple easy questions. If I got the hang of those, I would focus, more on the medium and then the hard.
Right.
And then, I would do it until I was getting like a decent accuracy and then I would move on. So I wouldn't
Right.
necessarily exhaust like every single question on each section for the sake of time, but I would make sure that like I was getting a decent accuracy in the medium/hard questions before I would move on to the next section.
Yeah. And we have those discussions with students a lot. Like, if someone's starting from scratch and they really need all the stuff, all those chapter tests, it's like, okay, well, you got to do them. Like, you need the practice. I think there's a really fine line between enough practice and not enough practice. So sometimes students will come in and they'll be like, well, I did one easy, one medium, one hard. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily enough for you to solidify the skills you're learning in the chapters. And that's, like I said, it's a formula, right? Like, you're going to learn great stuff in the chapters. The example questions are great. And sometimes you can convince yourself that you know more than you do. So you move to the chapter test. And if you're really crushing those chapter tests, then okay, you can move on. And then, of course, there's a different number of chapter tests depending on the chapter. I mean, if you're in rates, you could probably just do all of them because there's not as many chapter tests than, say, number properties or linear and quadratic equations or something along those lines. But again, I mean, the proof is in the pudding. You both got 760s, and you made it work for you, and that's really important. Now, outside of the study plan, as I'm sure you know, because you were immersed in the course for a while, we have a lot of like really impactful features. We're continuing to add to them. Well, what are some things that you guys used within TTP, just outside of the general framework of the study plan, that helped you as you were kind of trying to get all this information down?
Yeah, I can start with that. So for me, I really, really liked the equations sheet. There was like
Yes.
there was like a quick facts equations sheet that would be
Right.
or I think there was, sorry, not just a sheet, it was a few sheets, but
Yes,
we
the
had,
PDF that has the
yeah.
different chapters. Yeah, I really like
So
that
I would
sheet too.
actually, before both of my exams, I remember printing that out and reviewing it, or like I would go through and highlight the ones that I knew I had trouble with. And they had a lot of like great rules, like for example, like how to calculate greatest common factor, lowest common multiple really quickly, or um, multiples of 4 and 8, and you know how they how what I guess number patterns to look for, things like that. So that was really helpful for me. And then also another thing that was very helpful was you could customize your own practice. So for me, I would literally go to, like, let's say I had a lot of trouble on like 2 specific math concepts. I would literally click medium and hard, those 2 math concepts, maybe like 20 questions, and just drill them. And this is towards the end of my practice. I wouldn't start with that, but at the end of my practice, I was like, okay, what are the things that I'm still really struggling with? Because there's always going to be something. You can't be great at everything. So those 2 things I think were the most helpful for me.
Yeah, I'll just add on that, especially to the second one that Shanaya was saying. So one great thing about Target Test Prep is it tracks some analytics for you throughout the entire time that you're taking the course. And I honestly didn't realize it was doing that until I got to review time. And I pulled open this sheet and it told me, hey, these are all the sections that you're strong in when you were taking the practice test throughout. Here's the areas that you're weak in. It was really helpful because, like I said, I was kind of on a time crunch before the test when I got to the end. So I didn't have time to review everything. I needed to hone in on, what I was bad at. So that analytics that Target Test Prep provides was really useful. And then I did the same thing Shanaya did. I said, okay, here are the 4 areas that I really need to work on. And TTP will auto-generate practice questions for you in those areas. And you can specify, how hard you want those questions to be. So that was very helpful.
Yeah. So for people that don't know what you're referring to, because it is a unique thing to Target Test Prep, like everything is intertwined in the course and you're not doing anything that isn't tracked or isn't a piece of data for you, right? Like even the time spent on the course on a weekly basis is given to you and provided. So everything is there so you can see it. But we have this thing called on target analytics, which is what Harrison was referring to. And it's not, when people think of analytics, they think of big macro analytics, like how am I doing in math or verbal, or how am I doing in number properties or rates or sentence correction as a whole. But this brings it to a very micro level. So what happens is, let's say you're doing linear and quadratic equations. Now within that chapter, we have concepts such as difference of squares, which is like its own lesson, or an equation trap where 2 variables are sufficient to determine those one equation with 2 variables works to solve for those variables. Another example of a lesson. Well, if you do a question of difference of squares and you get it wrong, it's logged in your analytics. So when you go into on target analytics, you click open the linear and quadratics chapter and you see how you're doing in each one of these micro topics or lessons. And then yes, from there you have the ability to either review what you did, go back to the lesson itself, or create a mini quiz on those questions. So it's really, really useful for when you get to the end of your prep. What do you have to do? What do you have to improve in? And it's even useful for test day because, and I don't know about the both of you, but you got amazing scores, right? But one of the things that people always say, and I felt this way as a GMAT student myself back in the day, is that you're never 100% set in all of these topics. It's almost like a game of whack-a-mole, and you just have to get to a point where you trust in your preparation, you trust in your abilities, but you're gonna have weak, weak topics. But that's normal. If you're a golfer, you probably have shots you don't want to hit, even if you're amazing at what you do. So did you guys feel like that coming into test day? Like, okay, I've been doing really well in my practice test, but I know everything isn't 100% set, but I'm going to trust the process I've been following, trust my preparation, trust my abilities, and you did it anyway?
Yeah, for me, I definitely felt that way.
Right.
I definitely felt more confident my second time around than the first time around because I had I knew that I was pretty solid in quant, and what I really needed to focus on was reading. So I had prepared much more for reading and actually figure out a strategy between my first and second times. So I will say that part made me more confident, but there's only so much you can trust in your strategy, right? Like, it's like you're going to be able to predict the questions in verbal
Exactly.
and things like that. So yeah, I just have to trust the process, essentially. I agree with
Right.
that.
Yeah, I'd second that. But I felt comfortable that I at one point knew how to do all of the questions, or should know how to do most of the questions.
Right.
But there's the time crunch, there's the
Yep.
test day jitters, there's all these other factors, and you just have
Yeah.
to accept that you're good enough, because you can't keep studying forever. You got to move forward and go
Yeah.
for it at some point.
Exactly. And Shania, you brought up an interesting point that you can't predict what you're going to see, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I've recently written a blog on this, and it's so important for people to understand that there is no extremely predictive, exactly predictive nature to what you're going to see on the test. Yeah, you can say you're going to see a mix of the 22 major math topics, for example, or that you're probably going to see a lot of number properties, but those are almost just those are ridiculously obvious statements. And the reason you can say you'll see a bunch of number properties, and I've kind of done these calculations, if you go to TTP and you combined rates, work, combinatorics, and probability, that equals the length of the lessons for number properties. And if you take those chapter tests, the number of questions for those chapter tests, it about equals number properties. So what's the point? Well, it's probably just as important to know rates, work, probability, and combinatorics as it is as a whole as it is to know number properties. So what does that amount to? No one knows what you're going to see, and it's all important. So that's why doing such a thorough approach is huge. And the other cool thing too, and I'm sure you guys notice this on the GMAT when it comes to your confidence level, and I say this a lot, there's a lot of really small things that you learn, like what's a terminating decimal, or the fact that the LCM of X and Y times the GCF of X and Y is the product of X, Y. And you may think along the way, like, man, I don't necessarily think that, like, why do I have to know those things per se? But if you can get a few of those on your GMAT, and you guys might be able to attest to this, obviously, you don't have to tell anyone questions you got on your GMAT, but just in general, like spotting questions where you were like, holy crap, I have a process for this, and I'm going to solve this in 20 seconds. From my perspective, I feel like that just does a wonder for your confidence. And once that happens once or twice, I feel like from that point on, you just feel like the test is gravy because you know that you've got it. Did you guys feel like that on your GMAT when you were taking it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a couple too where TTP showed you the process that was quick to do, and you're able to knock out, for me, one of those quant questions in 15, 20 seconds. And that just adds to your time bank for the rest of the test as well. So
Right.
absolutely true.
Yep. And what about for you, Shanaya? Did you feel like that as
Yeah.
well?
Yes, I would totally agree with that. I think the most time you can save, the better, honestly, because
Right.
if you have more time left for the last few questions, that's great. And I think, especially if you're able to finish that question 50 to 20 minutes, odds are you probably know what you're doing. You're probably going to get it right. And maybe the later questions are going to be harder then. So then you want more time for those harder questions.
Yeah, exactly. And like I once had a student tell me like years ago, like, hey, I didn't do well. Okay, what happened? Well, I was double checking my questions. And I'm like, whoa, you can't do that because you don't have the time to do that. And you're not always going to have a warm, fuzzy feeling when answering questions. You're going to feel 95% right. And you're just going to have to take the leap and keep moving. And as you said, to have the time for the harder questions. Like if you know a rule and you can answer a question in 15 seconds, yeah, it might feel funny, but you got to do it so you can bank that time when you need it. So yes, I agree 100% with all of that. Now there is a question here. I'll try to answer this the best I can. If you're moving from the 600 to 700 level mark, and I think, I don't know if you got here late, but Shanaya basically did that. I don't think it's a matter of how many questions you're practicing. It's about bringing up your skill level as a whole. And doing that is not just practicing questions, but it's learning the content and then practicing the questions to ensure that you've mastered that content, and doing it in a very topical, structured way, which is what we were just discussing about how, the target test prep study plan is laid out. So, certainly I don't see why you couldn't benefit from that as well. Now, moving on, I think something that people could benefit from here, because you guys do have amazing GMAT scores, is like, do you either, I'm sure you guys do, have some kind of personal, just recommendations in what people can be doing as they prep in general? Because it's an emotional process, it's a journey, there's ups and downs. So is there any sort of like general advice that you think people could benefit from?
Yeah, so I can start with that. So I think verbal and quant, I have two different kind of answers to that. So for quant, I would say when you're taking practice tests, I would definitely look over the questions you're getting wrong and understand why you're getting them wrong. And I think that's why target test preps are really great. I found that their explanations were really great for questions versus like the official GMAT book. I don't think their explanations were as thorough, or at least, if you got that, problem wrong, you can literally see on target test prep what concept is attached to that, and then know, okay, I have to start practicing. You can go to that concept and start practicing those questions. So for the next time you take that practice test, you get that type of question, you can probably get it or be more confident in your answer at least. And then from the verbal side, one thing I will say is that I think when I go through the practice test for verbal, and I look at my the ones I get wrong, I wouldn't focus too much on the reading and the critical reasoning, like why, like the specific question why you got it wrong. But I would go to the section of the target test prep that's associated with it and look at the strategy for how to look at these questions in the future. I think the strategy is the biggest thing for verbal versus for quant. I think it's a little bit more of a mix of strategy and like actual like knowledge and study, how much you studied and practiced. But for verbal, I think strategy helped me so much more. Even just like reading a book on the side every day, like a chapter, getting used to like reading again, because we also don't do that as much on an everyday basis. So at least I don't. So
Me too.
yeah, getting more into like the practice of reading long passages. I personally didn't need a lot of help on grammar. So I don't know if Harrison, you might have more tips on that. But yeah, I would say those were the two for me.
Got it. Makes sense. Yeah, Harrison, anything on your end that you think people could benefit from in general with their prep?
Yeah, maybe just a couple pieces of advice and take them for what they're worth. But the first one that was really big for me is setting aside specific time to study. And I know it's a generic response, but I think it's so easy to say, oh, I'm going to study this week, and we fit in a half hour here and there when we can. For me, it was important to actually block the time on my calendar and say, okay, between this hour and this hour, I am studying, whether I'm feeling like it or not, whether my friends are texting me saying we're going to do something or not, that this is my study time and I'm going to treat it like an appointment that I have to be at. So that was huge for me. And then the second thing I'd say is picking a plan and sticking to it. We've mentioned it a few times here, but I really enjoyed the study plan of target test prep. I think it was great. If it's not the one for you, okay, whatever it is, pick something and go with a plan that's actually going to teach you the concepts, not just give you a few gimmicks that may or may not actually be beneficial on test day, or an endless stream of practice problems. Take the time to find a plan that'll teach you the concepts and then stick with it. Honestly, that was the best part of target test prep for me, is every day I sat down to study in that dedicated time. I didn't have to wonder what I was going to study, because I was just working my way down that study plan. I didn't spend the first half hour bouncing back ideas. Should I do this or this? It was clearly laid out, and I was able just to get to work. So those are my two biggest recommendations.
Yeah. So I was going to actually bring that up next. You bring up a ton of good points. Both of you do. I want to address what you just said about having a plan. I mean, all that stuff, man, I say a lot of that verbatim. You need to treat your GMAT prep like it's its own entity. and you got to figure out what in your life can be cut out initially, right? Um, sometimes, like, obviously you can't cut out work and family responsibilities. So what do you cut out? Well, unfortunately, as you said, social things that you'd rather be doing than studying for the GMAT. And making an actual study calendar and a plan for yourself. Um, as you said, I'm going to be studying from 10 to midnight. I'm going to be studying from 7 to 10, 5 to 7 a.m. in the morning. Whatever it is, it has to be marked down somewhere, or you can just kind of just say, well, I'll get to it when I get to it. And then before you know it, as you said, you're doing 30 minutes here, 40 minutes there. You're totaling a couple hours a week. And then the thing just drags. And then you become, disenfranchised with studying altogether because, like, you're not improving the way you need to improve. And then it all kind of falls apart. I've seen that with students a lot. So I think the idea of setting up a plan, sitting down, and really thinking about it is important. And then, yes, on top of that, the fact that we have a study plan laid out for you. So when you sit down to study, you don't have the anxiety of saying, oh man, well, I'm here. Now I got to figure out what I want to do. So then you spend 20 minutes planning and you're just tired from planning what you're going to do that day in your prep. And then you're like, yeah, you know what? I'll get to this tomorrow. Like, all of it, it's all cumulative, right? So you need to have something that guides you. You need to make sure on a personal level, you have a plan of when you're studying, when you're not studying, et cetera. So I think anyone for looking for a top score, that's a must. So, really consider that when you start thinking about studying for the GMAT. I think it's huge. We do have some other questions. I passed the GMAT last week, got a 680, Quant 48, Verbal 34, and I want to get to a 700 in about 3 weeks. Okay, well, the first thing is 3 weeks is kind of a drop in the bucket. Not saying it can't happen, but if all possible, I would give yourself more than 3 weeks. And certainly you two can comment on how TTP could help this particular student. But I think in general, as we've kind of been saying throughout today's discussion, is that, things are laid out very clearly and structured in the target test prep course. So amongst that verbal 34, if you find that, hey, critical reasoning is really my issue, sentence correction is really my issue, you can go to those parts of target test prep and you can kind of hammer away at those topics, learning the content and then practicing questions. That would be the way to do it. And I'd be curious of, Shanaya and Harrison, if you have any thoughts on that, that goal of trying to obviously improve from a V34 using the course.
Yeah, so I would say it definitely depends on, I think for sure that verbal is where it's going to be the biggest jump in the score, like the biggest improvement that you'll see. And I found that, I don't know what your take is on this, but I found that an improvement in reading increases your score a lot more than an improvement in quant. I don't know, the specifics behind it, but I personally found that improving my reading score made my score jump a lot more than improving my quant score by a little bit.
It does have an overall weighted effect, yes. And the fact that you're at a Q48, I mean, fact is, if you're at a Q48, you could try to bump that up simultaneously with your verbal. I think the issue, though, is obviously the 3-week timeline. But
yeah, so for the 3-week timeline, I would say personally, I actually did that. But I will say my reading was like a 38 before, and I jumped to a 45 in 3 weeks. But I specifically focused only on reading in those 3 weeks and like very much put aside my social time to focus on this. And then for quant, I didn't study anymore necessarily. I kind of knew I was hitting my max on all my practice tests at that 48, 49. So I just did problems every day just for maintenance rather than to improve my score. So I just wanted to make sure I was remembering the math concepts and then really focus on the strategy for reading. And that's where I found my biggest jump. And that's how I improved my score the most. And I did do that in 3 weeks. So I wouldn't say it's impossible.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to hear. And Harrison, what about you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, the only thing I'll add is because the time crunch, I think it'll be more important than ever to hone in on the specific items that, you're struggling with rather than just saying, I'm going to improve my verbal or my reading. Like Jeffrey was saying, try and understand what areas you're actually struggling in
Right.
and focus up on those ones.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the ESR in general, I think is okay. I think for quant, it's tough to really make too much heads or tails of it, unless you're like very close to your score goal. For verbal though, it's a bit more impactful because you can break it down into those three main sections. And it may be apparent, like you could be, 85th percentile critical reasoning, 90th percentile sentence correction, and 20th percentile reading comp. And it's like, oh, well, there you go. Reading comp is what I need to improve in. So I would say in that case, the ESR could be helpful if you can find some glaring deficiencies in the verbal section. The other question is, please suggest some quant books to reach the 700. Well, we're here talking about target test prep. It's not a book. It's an online self-study course, but I would definitely suggest using that. And, I'm going back to a comment I think, Shanaya, you made about keeping track of all of this material. One of the things that I tell people to do, pretty much everybody, is take notes when you're learning, when you're going through the course. We do have these things called active review sheets, which essentially take each lesson. It's like a PDF that you can print out, and then there's blank space for you to put your notes. We also have the online note taking in the course. But the point is, if you're just reading or you're just watching our solution videos, then it's very difficult to ensure that you're actually, interpreting and understanding what it is that you're reading. Did you guys make it a point to do that as you were going through the material, to take notes, and then also maybe turn those notes into flashcards at some point?
Go ahead, Shanaya.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, just a real quick. One thing I did actually, and it wasn't exactly the active review sheets, but
Right.
there were takeaways for each lesson and you could flag them or save them.
The must knows, right?
Say that one more time.
The must knows, you mean?
Yes,
the little green boxes. Yeah,
right,
yeah. Okay.
Right. The must knows. So I really, really use those. So I would flag the ones that I felt that I didn't know very well, and then I would go back and review them before I would do the end of the chapter test. And then if I still couldn't remember them, I would keep reviewing them, and I would delete them as I would I would basically drill them as flashcards, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then to add on to that, those must knows were great. The other thing I did is I made flashcards just throughout. So I'd read a section or watch the video, whatever was in that module, and then I'd make flashcards in my own words. And that helped enforce that, I actually knew and understood the concepts rather than I just read through it. If I then had to make my own flashcard based on it. And then obviously just the act of writing it down helped me memorize it. And then when it came time to review, I had this huge stack of flashcards that I was able to run through that was very helpful.
Yep, totally agree. And when you put something in your own words, it ensures that you understand it. And there's like variations. Like you could put the difference was 2 squares, x squared minus y squared equals x plus y, x minus y. But then there's variations of that. So if you're getting a question wrong where it's like, well, what is the equivalent of x to the 50 minus y to the 50? And you didn't know that it was x to the 25 plus y to the 25 times x to the 25 minus y to the 25. Put that on a flashcard. I say that to people all the time. Now, we're actually in the process of creating our own flashcard tool on Target Test Prep, so it's going to be really cool. But, you can also make the old school flashcards that you carry around with you. You pull them out when you have a free 10 minutes. So then everything is kind of on the tip of your brain because there's so much stuff you have to learn for this darn test between verbal and quant. There's only 31 math questions. There's only 36 verbal questions. Like that's not a lot of opportunities to shine. So if you forget something obvious that you shouldn't forget because you just got to keep hitting it, it's going to be bad for your score. So yeah, that to me is a big part of the process. So you can be studying when you're not sitting down at your desk. When I was studying for the GMAT and I worked in an office, when I got on the subway, I just pulled the darn cards out. When I was sitting at a doctor's office, I pulled the cards out. Now, granted, this was unfortunately sad to say back in the day before there was even iPhones. So sure, there was less to do to keep my mind occupied, but just be disciplined and say, I'm not going to go on social media. I'm going to look at my flashcards and stuff like that. So I think that's really, really important. Now, another question. Do you guys have any tips for anyone who is struggling in reading comprehension? That is a question.
Shanaya, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I could totally take that. So, first of all, I would say, like I said before about reading a book. So I read it was more of a self-development book, but you could really take whatever book is interesting to you because that's what's going to help you more. And I would read a chapter every day because that led me to read a lot faster with a lot more efficiency. That's one step. A second step is using Target Test Prep. They break down by question the strategy you should use. So depending on the reading comprehension question, like I think some of them are like support the argument was one type of question, for example. So I would think about, when I would see the question on the reading comprehension section, I would use the Target Test Prep strategy that I learned through their website and try to employ that when answering the question. And eventually you don't have to think about it actively and it becomes kind of second nature. So it's just more about the practice of using the strategy. And then once you get to the actual test, it really becomes, second nature, as I mentioned. So those are the two things that really helped me personally for reading.
Yeah. I agree. I think that just as we were talking about too, when we're talking about taking notes as you go through our course to ensure that you understand things and you're interpreting them, taking notes as you're reading in our C passage is really important. But there's a distinction. When you're doing it in Target Test Prep, you're studying, you're not on the clock per se. So you're actually taking notes that are going to be helpful for you in a week, in 3 weeks, in 3 months. You're going to look back at them and say, okay, I understand this concept. With reading comprehension, you are on the clock. So a lot of times I feel like taking those notes is just to get you centered and say, okay, did I really understand what was happening here? You're probably not even going to refer back to those notes when you're answering questions. But if you understand the passage better and where everything's located based on the notes you've been making, then when you get to a question, you can go back to the right part of the passage pretty effortlessly to get the information you need to answer the question. That's where I feel like notes help. And yeah, as you said, it's about practicing, whether you're doing actual GMAT RC questions or other things similar to those. It's all the same process. It's reading, it's understanding, it's how one sentence relates to another sentence, how one paragraph relates to another paragraph, how there could be differing viewpoints within the same passage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So
that's great. So sorry, just based on that, I also wanted to add that I think for reading comprehension, another thing that I struggled with was trying to read the whole passage like very in depth before, or even looking at the questions before I read the passage. I would strongly suggest definitely reading it. I would read it with a little bit of urgency. Then I would make sure you're enough to be familiar with the passage and what type of passage it is. If one paragraph is just a contrast opinion to another paragraph, just the overall structure. And then I would go to the questions. I wouldn't look at the questions beforehand.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with that too. And Harris, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. If you do not, there is another question, which I'm sure you can respond to because you have plenty of experience. Will TTP along with the OG be enough to score 750? So I think given both of your experiences, you can easily answer that question. So Harrison,
in the OG, is that the
official guide? Yes, the official guide.
Right.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think Shanaya and I have both said it today that's exactly what we had was the official guide and TTP, and we both were able to score 760. So absolutely.
Yep. Cool. And someone's asking a question about practice exams, which I did want to get to. We obviously have the practice test phase at the end of Target Test Prep. And then I know, Shanaya, you obviously took the GMAT and then retook. So your whole practice test situation might be different. I mean, this question is asking, and you guys can just talk in general about how you utilize the MBA.com practice exams. But this particular question is, did you take any in the middle of your prep? Our opinion is not to do it because you haven't seen everything yet, and these are very valuable practice exams. So I would, besides taking one at the beginning to get a baseline score, I would always say to wait to the end. But maybe you could speak on that, and then also in general, like how you dealt with dealing with the MBA.com practice exams leading into test day.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start. I didn't take any during my studying. I waited until the end. Actually, I wish I had taken one as a diagnostic test at the beginning. I didn't. That's something I'd change if I went back. But then when I got to the end of my TTP study plan, I bought the pack of however many there are that you can buy in, a bulk pack, and worked through them one at a time. And so I'd take the practice test, then give it some time because there's always like a mental drain after you've just taken this huge practice test, and then go through the specific problems that I missed, try and understand which sections of, my study plan, the ones I missed, correlated to or corresponded to, and then go back and hone in on that section of studying, review my flashcards. And then, I'd review that entire week when possible, or at least give it 2 or 3 days, and then take my next practice test and just do the same thing until I made it all the way through all of them.
Yep, that's perfect. And Shanaya, how about you?
Yeah, so I did take one as a diagnostic. It might have been the one, I don't know if it was, I think it was a diagnostic test through the OG. So I'm not sure, it wasn't one of the ones that you would buy online.
I think, there's like 20 math, 20 verbal questions or something at the beginning of the book. Right. That one.
That was really helpful to me. I really like that. But then I did wait as well for the practice tests, and I also phased them a bit. I didn't take them like one after another, but I would take one, see what I got wrong, study a bit, take another one. And I planned out when I would take them all, because you kind of have to, if you want to be able to take all of them before your test, you have to plan out, the intervals you're going to take them at. So that's what I did. Yep.
That's perfect. Yeah. I think there's 6. It's a decent number, but they're all really great. And, the one mistake that I see people making is like, okay, well, I really want to get used to the time nature of the GMAT. So I'm going to take, 16 tests throughout my prep. And I think that's a bad use of your time and energy. I think you take the test at the end. Of course, if you're using target test prep, you're getting the time practice. Yeah, a lot of times it's same topics because you're doing chapter tests, but we do filter and review tests and review quizzes. So you're getting enough of that time practice where I don't think you need to be doing that every weekend. And it takes a lot out of you. You mentioned you did one every couple days, 3 days. It's a decent, that's a decent clip. You got to take the test, you got to review the test, you got to go back, fill in knowledge gaps, and then rinse and repeat. Yeah, I'd say 3 days is probably the minimum interval I would probably take, because then you need to rest your head prior to taking the next one. Another question that is here is, what advice would you give to students who want to ace the test? Well, honestly, I think everything you guys have said has been in the spirit of acing the GMAT. So I think cumulatively, the advice that both Harris and Shanaya gave today will give you some really good insight into best practices into acing the test. Obviously, this will be recorded, so you can watch some of the things they said earlier if you missed it. In summarizing some of the things they mentioned that are kind of thematic of what we're talking about today, it's just about having a plan in place of how you're going to prep. Having the right study materials is great. If you get target test prep, that's a very good step to getting a great score, but you can't just use target test prep without defining what your own plan is going to be to get through the course. And if you don't use target test prep, it's no different. You need a plan, and you have to stick to that plan, and you have to understand that it's going to be a journey and a process to get to where you need to go. And if you're steadfast in that process and you're doing the right things, like, you can be successful. But understand, even though Harrison and Shanaya did awesome and their advice is certainly poignant, your situation may not be the same to theirs, right? So you're going to have to take, and this goes with anything. You always take things with a grain of salt. Like Harrison said, he studied from 10 to 12 at night. Well, if that's not your situation, then that's not something you would do, but you could mimic that in your own personal way that would allow you to fit in, 2 hours of studying a day or something along those lines. So yeah, but watch this. Their advice is great, and obviously, as I said, the proof is in the pudding. They both scored 760 on their tests. So I don't see any more questions, and I don't know, Shanaya or Harrison, if no other questions come up, if you guys have any kind of parting words or advice for those in the thick of their journey. I'm sure it's nice to look down from the hilltops and say, I'm done with this. And for Harrison, you're in school at Booth, which is awesome. Shanaya, my guess is you're applying to schools right now, right?
Yes, I'm in the process. Yeah.
Great. So you'll hear back hopefully in the next couple months. So yeah, if you have any parting words of advice for everybody here or people watching this on YouTube at some point that you'd like to give out.
Go ahead, Harrison.
I'll just say it's a grind. You got to put in the hours and put in the work, but know that, even though they're not in the room with you, there's thousands of other students doing it at the same time somewhere else in the world. You're not alone. Take some time to, mental health breaks and take some breath, but don't let those things also get you off your study plan. Just keep working through it. And at the end of the day, it'll be worth it.
Yep. Totally agree.
Yeah, exactly. So I agree with Harrison, everything he said. And yeah, I think it's just about the long game. So definitely don't lose that drive. Don't try not, sometimes there'll be low points, but you just got to take a breath. If you need to take a break and then get back into studying, if you need to take a break for a few days. But yeah, it's definitely a long journey, but you just have to stick to it and you'll see the results.
Totally agree. Very good advice. So this has been awesome. This is our first kind of joint interview, so I've really enjoyed this. So just thank you again, Harrison. Thank you, Shanaya, for doing this, for imparting your wisdom. I'm sure plenty of people are going to learn a lot from this, and they're going to be able to use this as motivation and drive to keep their journeys alive. And as I said at the beginning, we're still doing the Black Friday sale. It's been extended. So check it out. It's 20% off any plan. This is the biggest sale we've had all year. Code is Black Friday 20. And thanks again, everybody, for listening. And hopefully I'll be back at some point in the future. And we'll talk to everybody soon. So thanks again, Shanaya and Harrison.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.